Rain hammered the iron gates as Lydia Carter stood trembling beneath her old umbrella. The handle of her mop bucket cut into her fingers, but she didn't loosen her grip. Her resume, damp and wrinkled, pressed against her chest like a prayer. The mansion on the hill loomed above her, massive, cold and silent except for the distant echo of thunder. Every glowing window looked like a watchful eye, warning her she didn't belong. She whispered to herself, "Lord, give me strength," and pushed open the gate. Inside, marble floors gleamed like ice. The air smelled of lemon polish and loneliness. Her old shoes squeaked as she stepped across the foyer, where two maids stood whispering behind the staircase. One gave Lydia a look, not cruel, just pitying. "You're the new cleaner?" the older maid asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Then remember this, don't go near the baby's room." The words hung heavy in the air. Lydia frowned. "The baby?" The younger maid crossed her arms. "He don't like strangers. None of them last." Lydia nodded quietly, though confusion prickled at her heart. She wasn't here to question anyone, just to work, survive, and send money home. She followed the head butler down long hallways lined with portraits, generations of wealth staring down at her, all pale and proud. The further she walked, the more suffocating the silence became. Even her breathing felt too loud. The butler stopped before a tall door and knocked once. "Mr. Reynolds will see you now." Inside the study, the air felt colder. A man stood behind a mahogany desk. Dark suit, flawless tie, not a hair out of place. He didn't look up as Lydia entered. "You're the cleaner," he said flatly. "Yes, sir." He pointed to a clipboard. "You'll start with the east wing. Floors, windows, library shelves. Stay out of the nursery." His tone was clipped, almost mechanical. Lydia nodded, eyes lowered. "Understood, sir." Only then did he glance at her, not at her face, but at her uniform. His gaze was distant, unreadable. "Be discreet. My son doesn't do well with noise." When she left the room, her heartbeat echoed in her ears. The man's presence lingered behind her, heavy, like a storm cloud. The other staff avoided conversation. The mansion was beautiful, but dead. Rooms so clean they felt untouched by life. Every clock ticked too loudly. Every corridor seemed too long. As she dusted the shelves in the grand hall, Lydia's eyes caught a photograph. A woman with gentle eyes holding a baby with a bright smile. Both gone now, she guessed. Only ghosts remained in this house. Her chest tightened. She reached into her apron pocket and touched the small, worn photograph of her own little boy. His smile was fading behind the creased plastic. He had been 6 when he died. Pneumonia she couldn't afford to treat. She closed her eyes, swallowing the ache. "Keep working," she whispered to herself. "Keep breathing." Hours passed. The storm outside grew louder. She moved from one empty room to another, her reflection passing through mirrors like a shadow. Somewhere above, faint footsteps echoed. Then silence again. When she returned to the hall, the two maids were whispering again. "I heard the last nanny threw herself out the back gate in the middle of the night," one said. "Nonsense," the other replied. "She just quit." Said the baby screamed like a banshee every time she walked in. Lydia's broom slowed. Why would a child scream like that? "Because he knows," the older one murmured. "He knows his mother's gone." Lydia turned away, unease prickling the back of her neck. She'd seen grief before. Her own had lived beside her for years. But something about this house felt trapped, like the walls themselves were mourning. Near sunset, she climbed the stairs toward the east wing. The hallway narrowed, carpet swallowing her footsteps. One door stood slightly ajar, painted white, decorated with tiny stars. The nursery. She froze. The butler's warning echoed in her mind. Don't go near it. But as she turned to leave, she heard it. The faintest whimper. It wasn't the sharp cry of an angry child. It was softer, trembling, like a broken melody. Her heart clenched. Without thinking, she stepped closer. The doorknob was cold under her hand. She leaned in, listening, silence. Then, suddenly, a scream ripped through the air so raw and piercing that she dropped her mop. The sound cut off just as quickly. The hallway fell still. Only the storm answered, rain slashing against the window pane. Lydia's hands shook as she stared at the white door. And then, nothing. No cry, no whisper. Only the heavy, suffocating quiet of a mansion holding its breath. The morning air hung heavy with fog as Lydia climbed the marble stairs, mop in hand. The storm had passed, but the mansion still felt like it hadn't exhaled yet. The halls were dim, silent, except for the faint squeak of her shoes against the polished floor. When she passed the nursery door, a faint creak made her stop. Then, without warning, a small red toy truck rolled out from the gap beneath it and stopped at her feet. Lydia froze. Her heart gave a startled jump. No footsteps, no voices, just that toy, sitting perfectly still on the carpet, gleaming in the morning light. She bent slowly, picked it up, and whispered, "Little one, did you drop this?" The door was slightly open now. Against her better judgment, she peeked inside. The nursery was pale blue, filled with expensive toys scattered like forgotten memories. And in the center of the room sat a boy, tiny, fragile, no more than 2 years old. He wasn't crying. He was glaring at her. His eyes, dark, stormy, followed her every movement. His small hands were clenched, his lower lip trembling. For a second, Lydia forgot to breathe. "Hi there," she said softly. "I didn't mean to." The boy suddenly slapped the floor, hard, then hit his own cheek, once, twice. Lydia gasped and stepped inside before she could stop herself. "Oh, honey, no, don't! Get away from him!" The shout struck her like thunder. Mr. Alexander Reynolds stormed into the room, his face pale with rage. He grabbed Lydia's arm and yanked her back from the child. "What did I tell you about this room?" His voice was low but shaking with fury. I didn't mean to, sir." "The toy? I don't care about toys," he snapped. "You have no idea what you've just done." Lydia's heart pounded. She glanced at the little boy, who had retreated into the corner, rocking silently, clutching a stuffed bear so tight it looked painful. "I'm sorry," Lydia whispered. "I heard him, and I just wanted to help." Alexander's jaw tightened. "You can't help him." "No one can." Her eyes softened. "Why does he cry like that, sir?" The words slipped out before she could swallow them. Alexander froze. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like ice. "Because he's broken," he said, like his mother left him broken. The silence that followed was heavier than the night before. Then he turned and left the room without another word. Lydia stood frozen, shame flooding her cheeks. The baby stared at her through the bars of his crib now, face expressionless, tears still glistening on his cheeks. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered. "I didn't mean to scare you." He didn't move. He just watched her, eyes wide and unreadable, until she quietly closed the door. All day, Lydia couldn't shake the image of him. That small, bruised face and those trembling hands. The maid spoke about him in hushed tones. "They say he hits himself whenever someone new comes near," one whispered at lunch. "He's like a wild thing. Nobody can calm him down." "Poor child," Lydia murmured. "Poor child?" Another scoffed. "Poor us. Every nanny quits crying." But Lydia couldn't join their laughter. Beneath their gossip she heard only pain. His and hers. She knew what loneliness could do to a soul. That evening, when most of the staff had retired, Lydia stayed behind to finish the hallways near the nursery. The lamps flickered low. Her mop glided softly over the marble floor. She paused outside the white door. From inside came faint sobs. Not screams this time, just quiet. Broken sobs that sounded like exhaustion. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and began to hum. It was a lullaby from her childhood church, slow and gentle, a gospel tune about mercy and light. Her mother had sung it when the world felt cruel, and Lydia had sung it again when her own son was sick. The melody floated through the cracks of the door. She didn't mean for it to. It just escaped, carried by memory. The sobbing quieted. Lydia kept humming, soft and steady. The sound filled the hallway, mingling with the faint hum of the rain gutter outside. Minutes passed. Silence. Then, the faintest sound. A hiccup. Then breathing. Calm and even. She smiled through tears she didn't expect. "Rest, little one," she whispered. "Rest!" She gathered her things and turned to leave. But just as she did, a gentle creak echoed behind her. The nursery door, the one always kept shut, began to open. A small hand appeared first, tiny fingers curling around the edge of the door. Then, slowly, a pair of dark eyes peeked through. The boy looked at her, unblinking. For the first time, he didn't cry. He just stared, silent, curious, as if trying to remember a face he had once known. The sound of laughter stopped Alexander Reynolds mid-stride. It couldn't be real. Not in this house. Not in his house. He froze in the hallway, hand still gripping a folder of business papers. The sound came again. Small, bubbling giggles spilling from behind the half-open nursery door. For a moment, he wondered if he was dreaming. His son hadn't laughed since his wife died. He pushed the door wider. Inside, the cleaner, the woman he'd nearly fired yesterday, sat cross-legged on the carpet, her uniform wrinkled, her hair escaping from its tie. In front of her, Ethan was crawling toward her mop bucket, tiny hands slapping the floor, giggling as he reached for the foam bubbles swirling on the water's surface. Lydia startled, nearly toppling the bucket. "Oh, sir!" She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding. I was just finishing the floor." Alexander's eyes darted from her to his son. Ethan didn't scream, didn't cry. He reached into the bucket, splashed the water, then looked back at Lydia, smiling. Smiling. Alexander's voice was rough with disbelief. "What did you do to him?" Lydia froze, hands trembling. "Nothing, sir. I just sang a little while I cleaned." "Sang?" He looked almost offended. "That's it?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "He seemed calmer, that's all." Alexander's gaze softened. Not warmth, just confusion. Ethan was crawling toward Lydia again, his small hand reaching up for her finger. Lydia hesitated, then knelt down and let him take it. The boy held on tight, staring at her face as though memorizing it. Then, faintly, he murmured something, a whisper, more breath than word. "Ma?" Lydia froze. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. She looked at Alexander, but his face had gone rigid, color draining away. He turned away sharply. "Don't encourage that. I didn't mean to. Just keep cleaning." His voice cracked, softer now, almost pleading. "Please." For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt fragile, like a glass that could shatter if either of them breathed too loud. Ethan, oblivious to the tension, was dipping a small toy into the mop water, delighted by every ripple. Lydia let out a small, shaky laugh. "He likes bubbles." Alexander said nothing. He just stood there, watching his son's laughter fill the room that had known only crying. Finally, he muttered, "You can clean near the nursery from now on, but don't overstep." Lydia nodded, trying to hide her relief. "Yes, sir. Thank you." He left the room quickly, as though running from the sight of happiness. The butler appeared in the doorway a moment later, his voice low. "In all my years here," he said quietly, "I've never heard that child laugh." Lydia smiled softly. "Maybe he just needed a song," the old man's eyes warmed. "Or maybe he needed you." The rest of the day moved differently. The mansion, once so silent, felt alive again. Lydia hummed while she cleaned, and Ethan followed her movements with his eyes, fascinated by every sweep of her mop. At lunchtime, she passed by the open study door. Alexander sat inside, pretending to read, but she noticed the way his eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward the sound of his son's laughter. For a moment, she saw something break in his expression. Grief, yes, but beneath it, a flicker of hope. By evening, Lydia was exhausted, yet strangely light-hearted. She packed her things, humming as she walked through the long corridor toward the back exit. The butler called after her, "Good night, Miss Carter." "Good night," she said with a small smile. The rain had returned, soft and steady. She pulled her coat tighter and started down the narrow street that wound away from the mansion's gates. The world felt gentler somehow, as if that child's laughter had thawed a piece of her own frozen heart. But halfway home, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She stopped beneath a flickering street lamp and answered. "Hello!" A whisper on the other end. Shaky. Frightened. "Lydia! It's Rosa! From the mansion!" "Rosa? What's wrong?" "You need to be careful," the maid said quickly. "Someone's been asking about you. The boss's family, his sister, Veronica, they don't like you getting close to the child." Lydia frowned, her breath fogging in the cold air. Why would she care? "I'm just a cleaner." "That's the point," Rosa whispered. "They don't like your kind anywhere near their blood." Static crackled through the line. Then, click, Lydia lowered the phone, her heart pounding. Across the empty street, a car idled quietly. Headlights dimmed. She couldn't see the driver, but she felt the eyes watching her. The night that had felt calm moments ago now pressed against her chest like a warning. She turned, clutching her bag, and hurried toward home, unaware that behind her, the car's engine started slowly, following at a distance. The day began like any other, until Lydia saw the rose. It lay across her mop bucket. The petals shriveled, the stem snapped. The faint scent of decay hung in the air, thick and ugly. Someone had left it there deliberately, not a gift. A message. She stared at it in silence. Around her, the other maids busied themselves, pretending not to notice. But she heard the whispers anyway, muffled snickers, fragments of cruel words carried on the clatter of dishes, and the hiss of a vacuum. "Doesn't know her place. Oh, wait, till the boss sees what she's doing in the nursery? She's lucky he hasn't fired her. Already." Lydia picked up the dead rose with gloved fingers and dropped it into her trash bag. "Not today," she murmured to herself. "I've had worse." And she had. Life had already taught her how to survive small cruelties. The kind that bloomed in quiet corners, whispered behind closed doors. But when she reached the nursery, the darkness in her chest began to ease. "Liddy!" Ethan's voice was tiny but bright. He was sitting on the rug, holding his wooden toy broom, sweeping it across the floor exactly the way she did. The sight made Lydia laugh before she could help it. "You're better than me at this," she said. The boy grinned and babbled something that sounded like, "Broom, broom," before pretending to sweep her shoes. "You're gonna make me lose my job, little man," she teased. "Mr. Reynolds won't need me anymore." Unseen by either of them, Alexander stood by the doorway, half hidden behind the frame. He had meant to scold Lydia for being late, but the words never formed. He simply watched. His son, once unreachable, now glowed with life. Ethan laughed every time Lydia wrung out the mop, fascinated by the way water splashed into the bucket. When she sang under her breath, he hummed along in clumsy imitation. Alexander's jaw tightened. It should have been him, his voice soothing his son, his hands guiding him. But all he'd given the child was silence. He stepped back before either noticed him and retreated down the hall. That evening, the quiet of the mansion broke with the sound of expensive heels clicking against marble. Veronica Reynolds, tall, elegant, and sharp as glass, swept into the dining room. Her perfume filled the air, cold and floral. "Brother," she said with a thin smile, "you look pale. Still burying yourself in that mausoleum of a company?" Alexander exhaled. "It's called working, Veronica." She tilted her head, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling. "I saw the cleaner upstairs. His fork froze halfway to his mouth." "And? She's unusual?" The pause stretched. "Unacceptable, actually," he frowned. "She's competent. The house is spotless." "Oh, I'm sure it is." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "But we both know appearances matter. Imagine what people would think. Our family hiring someone like her to be near Ethan." Alexander's tone darkened. "Someone like her?" Veronica sipped her wine, unbothered. "Don't pretend you don't understand. This house carries a legacy, Alexander. You can't let pity blur your standards." Lydia, passing by the dining room with her cleaning cart, froze at the doorway. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but every word landed heavy and clear. Veronica leaned closer to her brother. "Remove that woman before people talk." For a moment, Alexander didn't answer. His hand trembled against his glass. "You don't get to tell me who belongs in my house," he said finally, voice low. "Then maybe I'll tell our father's board who's living here," Veronica replied sweetly. "A grieving widower letting the help mother his child." Silence swallowed the room. Lydia's heart twisted. She pushed her cart away as quietly as she could, blinking back tears. That night, she packed her things slowly in the maid's quarters. Her cleaning gloves, her apron, her little tin of tea bags. She told herself she should leave. It wasn't worth the insults, the stares, the danger. She'd faced enough ghosts in her life already. But as she stepped into the hallway, tiny footsteps pattered behind her. "Ethan!" He toddled forward, clutching at her skirt with both hands, his big brown eyes pleading. "Liddy," he whispered, holding out his wooden broom. Her throat closed. "Oh, sweetheart." She crouched down and wrapped her arms around him. For a moment, the ache and cruelty of the day melted away in the warmth of that small embrace. "I can't stay," she whispered into his hair. "Not if it hurts your family." Ethan just held tighter, refusing to let go. A cold voice broke the moment. "Touching!" Lydia looked up, and there, at the end of the corridor, Veronica stood in her silk dress, a shadow stretching behind her. "You think you're saving him?" she said softly, almost kindly. "You're just a replacement. The help his mother already ruined." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. Veronica stepped closer, her heels clicking like a metronome of menace. "Take my advice, Miss Carter. Leave before this house swallows you, too." The light above flickered once, then went out, and the corridor fell into darkness. Thunder split the sky in half. Rain hammered against the mansion windows, turning the world outside into a blur of gray and lightning. The power flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness swallowed the Reynolds estate. A scream echoed through the hallways. Not a woman's, a child's. "Ethan." Lydia dropped her mop and ran. "Ethan!" she shouted, her voice swallowed by the roar of the storm. "Where are you, baby?" Staff scurried in panic, flashlights bouncing against marble walls. Someone shouted, "Check the nursery!" Another yelled, "He's not there!" Lydia's heart thudded painfully. She didn't think. She moved, darting from room to room, her hands trembling as she flung open every door. "Ethan!" No answer. A clap of thunder shook the chandeliers. Wind howled through a cracked window pane. Lydia's breath came short. Every dark corner looked alive, every shadow holding something she feared to find. Then, faintly, a soft sound. Not a cry, but a hiccup. She turned her head. Under the grand piano in the corner of the drawing room, two tiny eyes glistened in the dark. Ethan. He was curled beneath the piano bench, shaking, clutching his toy truck against his chest. His lips quivered, his face streaked with tears and dust. Lydia dropped to her knees and reached under the piano slowly. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "I've got you now," he whimpered, trying to shrink back. Lightning flashed across his face. Fear, pure and deep. I know," she murmured. "It's loud. It's scary. But listen, baby. It's just the sky talking." Her voice softened into a song, the same old gospel lullaby she'd once sung to her own little boy. Her voice trembled, but she kept singing. Each note floated through the air like a light in the darkness. Ethan's sobs slowed. His breathing eased, and then, slowly, he reached out, tiny fingers brushing hers. Lydia smiled through her tears. "There you go," she whispered. "Come on, my brave boy." She pulled him gently into her arms, cradling his trembling body against her chest. The storm outside cracked again, but inside that room, a fragile calm bloomed. The door burst open. "Where is he?" Alexander's voice cut through the dark like thunder. His coat was drenched, his hair slicked to his forehead. "Lydia, where's my son?" She turned. Ethan stirred in her arms, half asleep now, his head nestled against her shoulder. "I found him," she said softly. Alexander froze. His flashlight beam fell on the sight. His son, safe, calm, resting in the arms of the cleaner he had once ordered not to touch him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Only the storm answered for him. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "You saved him." Lydia lowered her eyes. "I just did what any mother would." Something shifted in his expression, the harsh lines of anger melting into exhaustion. He stepped closer, kneeling beside her. "He hasn't slept through a storm since—" He stopped. "Couldn't finish since his mother died." Lydia understood without him saying it. She looked around the room, the faint shapes of picture frames on the mantel, the smiling woman in each one. Beautiful, alive, now forever gone. "You loved her very much," Lydia said quietly. Alexander didn't answer. His gaze was distant, locked on his son. She was light. He lost it the night she did. The words cracked something inside him. And her. For the first time, the mansion didn't feel like a cage of marble and grief. It felt human. Broken, yes, but still alive. Ethan shifted, his small hand brushing Alexander's wrist. The man flinched, then slowly covered his son's hand with his own. The moment hung there. Fragile. Healing. Outside, the wind softened. The thunder rolled farther away. They sat together in silence, the storm easing into a gentle rain. Lydia's dress was damp, Alexander's suit soaked through, but neither cared. For a few minutes, the world felt still. Ethan slept peacefully, his tiny breaths syncing with the rhythm of the rain. Alexander glanced at Lydia, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay near him tonight, please." Lydia nodded. "I will." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Thank you." It was the first time he'd said her name without authority. Just gratitude. Hours later, as dawn began to bleed pale light through the storm clouds, the mansion felt changed. The silence wasn't as heavy. There was warmth in the air, but peace never lasts long in the Reynolds house. At breakfast, the tension returned, not through thunder, but through whispers. The staff gathered around their phones, murmuring. One of them glanced up as Lydia entered, then looked away quickly. On the screen, a photo glowed. Lydia sitting on the floor with Ethan in her arms, his head on her shoulder, her eyes closed in song. The caption read in bold letters, "From maid to mother." Veronica's polished voice sliced through the murmurs. "Seems the world loves a scandal," she said smoothly, holding her phone for Alexander to see. "And this one stars your cleaner." The blood drained from Lydia's face. Alexander's eyes darkened as the staff fell silent. The storm outside had ended, but a far more dangerous one had just begun. Rain fell again that morning, soft, relentless, like the world was weeping with her. Lydia stood in the grand hallway, her apron folded neatly in her hands, eyes downcast as the mansion buzzed with whispers and accusations. The same photo that had spread across the internet now glowed from a tablet on the lawyer's lap. Her and Ethan, in that stolen moment of calm during the storm. "She's overstepped boundaries," the lawyer said sharply. "The optics are unacceptable, Mr. Reynolds. We're already fielding calls from the board." Alexander sat stiffly at the head of the table, face unreadable. His silence hurt more than anger ever could. Lydia tried to speak. "I never meant," but the lawyer cut her off. "We understand you grew close to the boy, but this family has an image to maintain. You're being placed on suspension, effective immediately." "Suspension?" she repeated softly, her voice trembling. Two security guards stepped forward, their eyes cold, mechanical. "Ma'am," one said, "we'll escort you to collect your belongings." The hallway felt longer than ever. Every portrait, every mirror, every step echoed the same message. "You don't belong here." As she reached the front doors, a sound tore through the silence. "No, Ethan." The little boy came barreling down the staircase, tears streaking his face, clutching his toy broom. "Liddy!" he screamed. "Liddy!" Lydia turned, her heart breaking. "Sweetheart." He threw the broom, shouting words only a toddler could form. Raw, desperate. A lamp shattered. A vase crashed. "Stop!" Alexander's voice thundered, but Ethan didn't stop. He clawed at his father's legs, sobbing so hard he couldn't breathe. Lydia bent down, tears spilling freely now. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "You be good, all right? You're safe." But Ethan only screamed louder. "Don't go!" For a second, Lydia's eyes met Alexander's. His face was pale, torn between pride and something that looked almost like shame. But he said nothing. The door shut behind her. Outside, the rain was cold and merciless. Her shoes splashed through puddles as the mansion faded into the distance, its lights blurring through her tears. By the time she reached her tiny apartment, the exhaustion hit her like a wave. She dropped her keys, sank onto the floor, and finally let herself cry. She hadn't cried this hard since that night, the one she'd tried so hard to forget. The memory came without warning. Sharp, cruel, unstoppable. Her little boy, Isaiah, coughing in her arms. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The nurse's pitying voice. "Without insurance, we can't admit him." She'd begged. She'd screamed. She'd held him through the night, whispering prayers that never got answered. By morning, his hand had gone still in hers. Lydia pressed her palms against her face, sobbing until she couldn't breathe. "I tried, baby," she whispered into the silence. Mama tried. That guilt, that unbearable, endless guilt, was why she couldn't walk away from Ethan. Why she sang to him when others shouted. Why she saw herself in every tear that child shed. And now, she'd lost him too. Hours passed. The rain slowed. The city outside her window blurred into gray and gold. She thought of Ethan's laughter, his tiny hands reaching for her face, his voice saying her name like it meant safety. A knock shattered the silence. But when she opened the door, no one was there. Just an envelope on the floor. Inside was her final paycheck. And nothing else. Her lip trembled. She sank to her knees again, clutching the envelope like it might warm her somehow. Miles away, the Reynolds mansion sat in eerie quiet. Ethan hadn't stopped crying. His little face burned with fever, his body shaking as the doctor placed a thermometer under his arm. "He's exhausted," the doctor said gently. "Probably from stress, but his temperature's rising." Alexander stood by the bed, his shirt half-buttoned, his hands useless at his sides. "What does he need?" "Comfort," the doctor said. "Familiarity, someone he trusts," Ethan whimpered. his tiny voice raw and broken. "Liddy!" Alexander froze. "Liddy!" Ethan mumbled again, his hand reaching for empty air. The name stabbed through the silence like lightning. Alexander sank into the chair beside the bed, his throat tight, his chest aching in ways he didn't understand. He looked around the room, the toys, the rocking chair, the framed photos of the woman he'd lost, and realized something painful. For months, he'd been keeping ghosts alive. He'd filled the mansion with memories instead of love. And Lydia, somehow, she'd given his son both. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling. The screen lit up his face, pale and haunted. He hesitated only a moment before dialing the number he had once used to order her around. When the call connected, his voice was raw, stripped of every wall he'd ever built. "Lydia," he said softly, "please, come back. He needs you." Outside, thunder rumbled once more, but this time it sounded almost like a heartbeat. Smoke curled through the mansion's corridors like dark fingers. Lydia smelled it before she saw it. Sharp, acrid, choking. She'd barely stepped through the front gates when she saw the flicker of orange through the windows. Without thinking, she dropped her umbrella and ran. "Fire! Somebody help!" A maid screamed from inside. The main kitchen was chaos. Flames licked up the drapes, smoke clawing at the ceiling. Pots clattered to the floor. Staff ran in all directions, coughing, shouting, blinded by panic. "Get everyone out!" Lydia yelled, grabbing a cloth from a counter and wrapping it around her mouth. "Move!" She darted toward the kitchen sink, turned on the tap, and flung a stream of water at the nearest flame. It hissed, but the fire was spreading too fast. She could barely see through the haze. Somewhere upstairs, Ethan was crying, his terrified wails piercing the roar of the flames. "Ethan!" Lydia shouted. She turned toward the staircase, but a maid grabbed her arm. "You can't go up there!" Lydia tore free. "He needs me!" The stairway railing was hot to the touch, but she climbed anyway, her lungs burning, eyes stinging from the smoke. "Ethan, baby, it's me! Lydia's here!" She found him on the landing, curled near the banister, shaking. His little face was streaked with soot, his small hands over his ears. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, pulling him into her arms. "I've got you." He clung to her neck, sobbing against her shoulder. She covered his head with her arm and crouched low, inching toward the stairs. "We're gonna get out, baby. Just hold tight." Below, Alexander's voice roared through the chaos. "Where is my son? Where is he?" Then, from the far end of the hall, another voice, high, panicked. "Help! Help me! Veronica!" Lydia turned her head. Through the thick smoke, she saw Veronica trapped near a collapsed beam, flames closing in around her silk dress. The woman's face twisted in terror. "Please, somebody!" Alexander's shouts echoed from downstairs, but he couldn't reach her through the fire. Lydia froze for one heartbeat, then thrust Ethan into the arms of a nearby housekeeper. "Take him outside," she ordered. "Miss Carter, don't—" But Lydia was already running toward the fire. The heat was unbearable. Her sleeves caught sparks as she reached for the beam, using all her strength to lift it, just enough for Veronica to crawl free. Smoke filled her throat, her chest screaming for air. "Go!" Lydia rasped. "Get out!" Veronica stumbled toward the doorway, coughing violently. Lydia followed, stumbling after her as flames crawled closer. When they burst into the main hall, Alexander was there, eyes wide, drenched from the water hoses, shouting orders to the staff. He froze when he saw them. Veronica collapsed into his arms, shaking. Lydia staggered behind her, swaying on her feet, soot-streaked and gasping. "You?" Alexander's voice cracked as he looked at Lydia. "You went back in?" Lydia coughed hard, nodding weakly. She was trapped." Veronica turned her head, tears streaking through the soot. "She saved me," she whispered hoarsely. "After everything I said to her, she still saved me." The words broke something inside Alexander. He took a step closer, his voice trembling. I was blind. All this time I thought you were just— He stopped, his throat tight. You were the only light in this house. Lydia tried to answer, but her breath hitched. The edges of her vision blurred. Lydia! Alexander shouted, catching her as her knees gave way. Stay with me! Ethan broke free from the housekeeper's arms and ran to them, crying hysterically. Liddy! The paramedics burst through the front doors, rushing toward the fallen cleaner. One of them knelt beside her, checking her pulse. Smoke inhalation! She needs oxygen now! Alexander's hands shook as he brushed the hair from her face. Please, he whispered, his voice breaking. Don't take her from us, too. The paramedic fitted an oxygen mask over her mouth. Lydia's fingers twitched weakly, and then a tiny hand slipped into hers. Ethan. His cheeks were still wet with tears, his toy broom clutched tightly in one hand. He held her hand tightly, his little body trembling. His lips quivered as he stared at her face. And then, softly, shakily, he spoke. Mama. The word hung in the smoky air like a prayer. Alexander's eyes widened. Veronica covered her mouth. The paramedics froze for a split second before continuing their work. Mama, Ethan said again, louder this time, his voice breaking. Mama, wake up! Lydia's eyes fluttered, but she didn't move. The oxygen mask fogged with every weak breath. Hang in there, miss, one paramedic said urgently. We've got her! As they lifted her onto the stretcher, Ethan tried to follow, but Alexander pulled him close. His son buried his face in his father's shoulder, sobbing. Through the open doors, Lydia's stretcher disappeared into the flashing red lights outside. The mansion, once grand and proud, now stood covered in soot and ash, a black scar across its marble walls. Alexander looked down at his son, whose tiny voice still echoed that one word over and over. Fragile and full of love. Mama. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Reynolds prayed, not for wealth, not for power, but for the woman who had brought life back into his home to live long enough to hear it. The world came back to Lydia in fragments, soft beeps, a rhythmic hum, the faint scent of antiseptic and roses. Her eyelids felt heavy, as if stitched shut, but then she heard it. A small, steady breathing beside her. When she opened her eyes, she saw Ethan, curled up on the side of the hospital bed. His little fingers rested over hers. His cheeks were streaked from dried tears, his chest rising and falling in peaceful sleep. Her heart clenched. He's safe. Then she noticed the figure by the window. Alexander, his white shirt wrinkled, sleeves rolled, exhaustion etched deep beneath his eyes. He was watching her. The moment her gaze met his lips parted in disbelief. You're awake, he breathed, pushing off the wall and hurrying to her side. She tried to speak, but her voice came out cracked and dry. Ethan? He's fine, Alexander said quickly, his voice trembling with relief. The doctor said he just needed rest. He refused to leave your side. Lydia's eyes fluttered toward the sleeping boy again. A faint smile touched her lips. Thank God. Alexander sat in the chair beside her bed, his shoulders sinking as if 1,000 invisible weights had finally lifted. For a moment, he said nothing, just watched her. The silence filled only by the soft beeping of the monitor. The fire's out, he finally said. The damage is small. A few rooms, nothing we can't rebuild. His gaze softened. But the truth was much bigger. Lydia frowned weakly. What truth? He exhaled slowly. That I was blind. That you weren't just saving a house. You saved my family. The words caught her off guard. Lydia blinked, trying to process them. But he went on, quieter now. You saved Veronica's life. You saved Ethan's. You even saved me. From becoming a man my wife would have hated. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. I owe you everything. Lydia's eyes glistened. She wanted to answer, but the lump in her throat stopped her. Instead, she reached for Ethan's hand and squeezed it gently. Moments later, a soft knock sounded at the door. Alexander stood, and Veronica stepped in. Gone was the perfect poise. Her hair was tied back, her eyes red and swollen. She carried a bouquet of lilies and a trembling kind of humility. "Lydia," she began, her voice cracking. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I said terrible things. I let jealousy and grief make me cruel." Lydia stayed quiet, her eyes kind but tired. Veronica placed the flowers on the bedside table. "You could have left me there. You should have, but you didn't." Her voice broke completely. "I've told the world what you did. I told them the truth." Outside, somewhere down the hall, Lydia could hear the faint hum of a television, the news anchor's voice drifting in through the half-open door. "Cleaner saved Millionaire's family from fire. Lydia Carter hailed as a hero." Lydia blinked in disbelief. The same media that mocked her days ago was now using her name with reverence. Alexander smiled faintly. "The story's everywhere. The staff, they've been calling non-stop. They want to see you, to thank you." Lydia shook her head, a tear slipping free. "I didn't do it for thanks. She looked at Ethan. "I just couldn't lose another child." Alexander's expression softened, his voice a whisper. "You won't. Not again." He reached across the bed and gently took her hand. Not as an employer, but as a man finally stripped of all pride. His thumb brushed her knuckles. "You gave my son something I couldn't. You gave him back his smile." Ethan stirred, blinking sleepily. When his eyes found Lydia, he sat up slowly and reached out. "Mama." The word was softer this time. Not desperate, but sure. Lydia pulled him close, her tears silent, her heart overflowing. "I'm here, sweetheart. Mama's right here." Alexander turned away for a moment, his jaw tightening, trying to hide the emotion in his eyes. When he looked back, his voice was quiet, sincere. "I owe you more than a job, Lydia," he said. "I owe you my son's smile." For a long time, no one spoke. The morning sun spilled through the hospital window, painting the room in gold. The storm finally gone, leaving behind only the light. And for the first time, Lydia believed in miracles again. The Reynolds mansion no longer felt like a tomb. Sunlight streamed through wide-open curtains, spilling warmth onto the nursery walls, now painted in soft yellows and sky blues instead of cold gray. The old lace drapes had been replaced by light cotton ones that fluttered gently in the breeze. Lydia hummed as she arranged new toys on the shelf. A wooden train, a teddy bear with one floppy ear, and a little stack of colorful books. Ethan sat on the rug nearby, giggling as he scribbled across a sheet of paper with crayons. His laughter, once sharp and broken, now bubbled freely, filling the room with life. Every now and then, Lydia stopped just to watch him. That sound, that pure, innocent joy, was a kind of music she hadn't heard since her own son. It was healing something deep inside her that she thought would never mend. Behind her, a low voice spoke softly. "It's different now, isn't it?" She turned. Alexander stood in the doorway, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, his expression caught somewhere between gratitude and wonder. Lydia smiled faintly. "It finally feels like a home." He stepped into the room, glancing around at the bright walls and the scattered toys. "When my wife passed, I shut all the curtains," he said quietly. "I told myself it was to protect Ethan. But really, I was hiding." Lydia's hands paused over the toy shelf. "Grief makes us build walls," she murmured. "But love—" She turned to face him. "It opens windows." For a long moment, they stood there in shared silence. Two souls who had carried too much loss. Finally learning to breathe again, Alexander's eyes softened. "I owe you more than I can ever say, Lydia." You didn't just help my son. You helped me remember what it means to feel. She met his gaze, calm and kind. You didn't owe me anything, sir. Pain, it can make us forget love still exists, but it's always there, waiting. He looked at her as if truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a cleaner, not as an employee, but as someone who had quietly stitched his broken family back together. Would you stay? He asked almost hesitantly. Not as staff, as part of our lives? Lydia hesitated, her heart tugging between humility and hope. If it's what you and Ethan want. Before he could reply, a small voice piped up from the floor. Looky, Mama Liddy! Ethan's tiny hands held up a sheet of paper covered in thick crayon lines. The drawing was simple, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a big yellow sun. Above them, in crooked letters, he had written, Me, Daddy, and you. Lydia froze. The crayon trembled slightly between Ethan's fingers. Her throat tightened as she crouched down to meet his eyes. You drew this? Ethan nodded proudly. That's us! She couldn't stop the tear that slid down her cheek. Her arms went around him in a soft hug, and he giggled, patting her face. Alexander knelt beside them, looking at the drawing. His voice was barely a whisper. He's never drawn anyone before. Not even me. Lydia traced a gentle finger over the stick figures. Imperfect, colorful, alive. The picture wasn't just a child's scribble. It was forgiveness, rebirth, family. She looked up at Alexander, her voice steady but full of emotion. Children know what adults forget. Love doesn't ask for permission. It just finds a way. He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. As Lydia pinned Ethan's drawing on the freshly painted wall, sunlight caught the waxy colors and made them glow. A small miracle of its own. Outside, the wind stirred the roses near the garden window, scattering their scent through the room. The house that had once known only silence now breathed with laughter, warmth, and the promise of new beginnings. Ethan tugged Lydia's sleeve and pointed proudly at his art. It's our family, he said. Lydia smiled through her tears. Yes, baby, it's our family. And for the first time, the mansion on the hill no longer looked lonely. It looked alive. Laughter echoed through the grand halls where silence once lived. Children ran across the marble floors of the Reynolds mansion. Children from the orphanage downtown, dressed in donated clothes and wide smiles. Balloons floated against the crystal chandeliers, and sunlight poured through windows that had been shut for far too long. At the center of it all stood Lydia Carter, clipboard in hand, eyes glistening. She watched as a little girl painted Ethan's face with messy blue streaks, both of them giggling uncontrollably. For a moment, Lydia forgot the months of struggle, the whispers, the fire, and simply felt peace. The mansion that once felt like a prison of grief had become a place of laughter. The sound of joy filled every corner. Alexander stepped up to the small stage set up near the grand staircase. Dressed in a simple gray suit, he looked less like a businessman and more like a man reborn. When he spoke, his voice carried warmth instead of pride. Thank you all for being here, he began, glancing toward Lydia and Ethan. This house once knew only sorrow. Today, it knows laughter again. Because one woman refused to walk away from a crying child. The crowd of guests, staff, and children fell silent. Lydia froze, her breath catching. Alexander continued, his voice soft but steady. In memory of my late wife, and of Lydia's beloved son, I am proud to announce the opening of the Hope Smile Foundation, a place dedicated to helping children find joy again. Applause filled the room. Lydia pressed a trembling hand to her chest, tears brimming in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. Not the recognition, not the love that radiated from the faces around her. Alexander turned toward her. And today, I want to name Lydia Carter as our first foundation director. The applause grew louder. Even the maids who once whispered behind her back now clapped, smiling. Veronica stood nearby, eyes lowered but wet with tears, this time tears of respect. Lydia stepped forward, her heart thundering. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Alexander smiled faintly. "Say yes. The rest we'll figure out together." She laughed softly through her tears. "Then yes. Yes, I'll do it. For them. For every child who needs a smile." Ethan, hearing her voice, came running through the crowd. "Mama Liddy!" he shouted, arms wide open. Lydia crouched, catching him mid-run, spinning him in her arms. His laughter rang out like music. "Look, Mama Liddy! Balloons!" he said, pointing at the colorful bunch rising toward the ceiling. She kissed his forehead, holding him close. "Yes, baby, balloons and sunshine, just like your smile." For a moment, time seemed to stop. Alexander watched them. The woman who had once arrived with nothing but a mop bucket and a prayer, and the boy who had once refused every touch but hers. His chest ached, but it was no longer the pain of loss. It was gratitude. He stepped closer. "You changed everything, Lydia," he said quietly. She looked up at him, smiling softly. "No, Mr. Reynolds, we did." He shook his head. "No. You taught me something money never could. That kindness heals where money cannot." Ethan tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, look! I'm happy now." Alexander bent down, gathering both Lydia and Ethan in a gentle embrace. "Yes, son, you are, because she showed us how." Outside, the rain that had once marked Lydia's first day at the mansion had been replaced by sunlight. Rays streamed through the tall windows, painting the floor in golden warmth. The once cold house finally felt alive. Not because of wealth, but because of love. As the children played and music drifted through the hall, Lydia stood by the open window, Ethan on her hip. The city stretched below, glowing in the afternoon light. She whispered to herself, "Maybe some stories don't end in loss. Maybe they end in grace." Ethan laughed, pointing at the sky. "Mama, look! It's shining!" She smiled. "Yes, sweetheart. It's shining for all of us." And as the scene faded, a mansion filled with laughter, a father healed, a woman redeemed, and a child reborn in joy. The voiceover carried the final truth. Kindness heals where money cannot. Sometimes the smallest act of love can bring a broken home back to life. The camera lingered on. Ethan's radiant smile, the smile that changed everything. "If this story touched your heart," the narrator's voice whispered, warm and steady, "share it, because every smile has a story worth telling."